Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, and this video is about John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which was published in 1690. So we're continuing here with part one of our book of the four fundamental questions, and the first fundamental question is, who or what am I? We saw the Hindu conception of the self as an eternal soul that reincarnates, transmigrates from one material body to another. We saw the Buddhist conception that there is no self, there is no individual soul, there's a series of unconnected body parts and thoughts, underlying which there is no unifying substance that stays the same from one moment to the next. So there is no self. The idea of a self is just a word, said the Buddhist monk Nagasena to the Greek king Melinda. And then we went to Plato, his dialogue, the Phaedo, at the end of which Socrates drank the poison, but before doing which he was trying to convince his friends not to be afraid of death, because he reasoned the self is, like the Hindus say, an eternal soul that transmigrates and furthermore is related to God and demigods, and that the soul is equipped with these eternal forms of knowledge, these absolute ideas, like the idea of absolute equality or justice or beauty or any absolute concept you can think of. And in his opinion, the material world is like a shadow of that absolute spiritual world. So there's two worlds, a spiritual world and a material world. The Hindus believe that, Plato believed that. The Buddhists believe that there is no, at any rate, as far as our reading went, the Buddhists say there is no enduring individual soul. So from Plato, we went to René Descartes, who is also a rationalist and a dualist. So for Plato, a rationalist, reason is the ability to perceive these absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. That's his argument for why there's life after death and life before death in the Phaedo. And René Descartes, his form of rationalism, he focused on the difference between humans and animals. Humans can speak and adapt their speech to any changing conversation, and we can adapt our physical bodies to any changing physical situation. Not every human can do that at any given time, but the human species as a whole is capable of adapting to any kind of changing physical environment. We can go to outer space, we can live at the bottom of the ocean. No other animals can do that. Fish can live better in the sea than we can, but they can't fly and go to space. So we've been all over that. From René Descartes, we are moving to John Locke. Now, John Locke is not a rationalist, he's an empiricist, but he doesn't make an issue of his empiricism in this reading. In this reading, he just wants to define what is a self. How do you define that term? And he's got he uses what seems like legal language to try to define his terms clearly, and even brings up the issue of how do you punish somebody for doing something if they weren't aware that they did it. Are they still guilty? Is it the same self who did it if the person that you are placed under arrest doesn't have any memory of doing it? And he would say, no, it's not the same self. We'll get to the reasons why. But the main point to keep in mind is, who or what am I? That's the fundamental question that we're trying to answer in this first part of the book. And in John Locke's opinion, the main point is the self is consciousness of itself. You're aware that you're a thinking being now. You're thinking, and in his opinion, it's impossible to think without knowing that you think. So when you reflect back on the fact that you're thinking, when you think about the fact that you're thinking, that's self. That's the anchor of a self. And then whatever memories you have of anything you've done in the past, or if it's possible, anything that you do in the future, that also includes yourself. So that's his main definition of a self. All right. Let me go to the discussion questions, and then as we answer those, we'll get a broader picture of Locke's argument. So discussion question 1 on page 97. Compare Locke's view to Descartes'. Which view do you think is better argued? Explain. So in the previous video, I went over Descartes' arguments, and his main argument is how he differentiates humans from animals, or he says if you could imagine a machine that's built to look and sound like a human, how would you be able to discern the difference between a machine that looks like a human and a human? And his two arguments, as we went over before, only humans can engage in a conversation and respond appropriately to anything that's said. After a while, you'd figure out that the machine had a series of fixed answers and it couldn't go beyond them, and an animal wouldn't have any response. A parrot might be able to say some words, but you can tell quickly it sounds like a human, but there's no intelligent response there. That's his main argument. It was a short reading. It's not that Descartes doesn't have other more elaborate aspects of his philosophy, but we're only comparing what we find in this book. In the previous reading in Descartes, you compare this reading from Locke to that. So what are Locke's arguments? Well, we'll get into those. The second part of this question is, which view do you think is better argued? So as I said in a previous video, when you have a part of the question, which view do you think is better argued, just because you think one view is better argued does not necessarily mean you think it's a better argument. You can believe one philosophical position more than another, but then you can find a person who defends the one you disagree with, that person argues their point better. So you can say, I think, for example, Locke's view is better argued, but I agree with Descartes' position that the self is an immaterial soul that does not have any extension in space, and it cannot be destroyed. It's created by God, cannot be destroyed. It's separate from the body. But you could say, but I like the way Locke defined his terms more carefully, so that's just an example. Let's get into the way Locke defines his terms. Actually, we'll go to discussion question 2, because that's how we're going to get into Locke's argument. Explain the distinction Locke makes between the terms man and person. Why does he make this distinction? All right, so he makes this distinction, the short answer is because he's trying to see what a person is. What is a self? Well, let's define our terms carefully. Is it the body? Is it a soul? Let's define what these terms mean, what we mean by these terms. So, if you turn to page 85, actually, in the very beginning, on page 83 at the bottom, he talks about how do you define motion and thought. And so at the very bottom, motion and thought, both which consist in a continued train of succession. Concerning their diversity, there can be no question, because each perishing the moment it begins, they cannot exist in different times or in different places as permanent beings can at different times exist in distant places. So he's saying a motion, like me moving my hand, each part of that motion stops existing the moment it starts existing. There's no permanence to a motion. It's a fleeting phenomenon. And similarly, a thought. I'm thinking a thought. There's no permanence to a thought, says John Locke, because it's over as soon as it begins. I have a thought of the color red. Okay, I can think again about red, but my thought of red will be interrupted inevitably, and then I'll have to have a new thought, and so that's his point. And I'm going into the details of his definition of motion and thought because the Buddhist argument is the same about the self. if the self is just thoughts, no two of which are permanently united by anything perceivable, then there is no self. And we'll see David Hume in the next reading make the same argument. So the way John Locke describes motion and thought, that's how the Buddhists and Hume define what we call a self. And John Locke, you can see how the philosophical pendulum is swinging from Descartes through Locke towards Hume, who's the ultimate empiricist, and he rejects, like the Buddhists, he rejects the idea of an immaterial substance, a soul that carries yourself. He'll reject it. Locke says, I'm not sure if there's a soul or not, and because it's hard to tell whether there is or isn't a soul, let's just narrow our definition of the self to something that we know exists, and that is consciousness. I know that I'm conscious of myself, and I have memories of things I've done in the past. Although right away I see a little bit of a conflict there, because his definition of a thought is that no two thoughts are ever the same. So how is it that if no two thoughts can be the same, a thought thinking a thought can be the same throughout time? So it's, as I said, you can see the transition happening. But at any rate, we're going to get into what Locke says. That's what you have to have knowledge of for the exams and whatever else, whatever other parts of the class you want to talk about Locke in. You could write a journal about John Locke. So he says here, the identity of man at the bottom of page 84. So the discussion question is, why does Locke differentiate between the terms man and person? And so let's just see how he defines man. And before I get into some of his legalistic language, his main point is that a man is a continuing living body. A body is a series of particles that change over time. It's a connection of changing particles, but they're united by the fact that they are part of one continuous life. So a man is simply a human form that continues to live from one moment to the next. Even though the body of that man is constantly changing in subtle and small ways, the fact that those constantly fleeting particles of matter are organized in a human form that gradually changes through one continuous life, that's what a man is. If a man were to be hit in the head and lose all consciousness and go into a vegetative state, you would still say, oh, look at that poor man. He's unconscious of everything. But you would still say it's a man. It's a living human form. That's what a man is. So if that's what a man, and the reason that he wants to distinguish a man from a person is because he's trying to get to what is a self. Is a person something different than just a living human form? And he'll say, yes, a person is conscious of its own consciousness plus its memories, as I've said before. Now, therefore, he's saying maybe you could have a person exist in an immaterial substance. Maybe the person is just a byproduct of the material body. Locke will say, in his opinion, at the top of page 94, he says, I agree the more probable opinion is that this consciousness is annexed to and the affection of one individual immaterial substance. So he says he thinks consciousness is connected to a soul. But let men, according to their diverse hypotheses, resolve of that as they please. This every intelligent being, sensible of happiness or misery, must grant that there is something that is himself, that he is concerned for and would have happy. So he thinks the desire for happiness is a symptom of the self. So he's going to, continuing in that paragraph number 27 on page 94, he says, in all which account of self, the same numerical substance is not considered as making the same self, but the same continued consciousness, in which several substances may have been united and again separated from it. So he talks about reincarnation. And he brings up someone he knew who turns out later he'll reveal to be the mayor of Queensborough, who once told him that he was the same soul as Socrates, and he had now reincarnated. So Locke is subtly making fun of this mayor of Queensborough. He doesn't overtly say the mayor of Queensborough said that. He says, someone once told me, a very reputable person with a good education, that he's the same soul as Socrates. And then later, he just gives an example on page 91. He says, section or paragraph number 21, page 91, which shows wherein personal identity consists. This may show us wherein personal identity consists, not in the identity of substance, which is a material body, that's a material substance, or a soul is an immaterial substance. So personal identity does not depend on being connected to any kind of substance, but as I have said, in the identity of consciousness, wherein if Socrates and the present mayor of Queensborough agree, they are the same person. So if the then mayor of Queensborough remembered drinking the hemlock that killed the body of Socrates, then according to Locke, they are the same person. And then he'll say, however, if it's just the same soul that was in Socrates and now is in the mayor of Queensborough's body, if the mayor can't remember anything Socrates did, he says, well, then you can have the same soul, but you're not the same person, because all that the term person refers to is consciousness of yourself and everything you've ever done. So he gets into a few of the puzzles associated with identifying consciousness with a soul. Is it possible for memories to be transferred from one soul to another? Why not? For example, in our technology today, we have the USB sticks, or used to be CDs, used to be tape cassettes, before that 8 tracks, before that LP albums, whatever they're going to come up with next. You can take the information from a movie and transfer it from one material substance, a CD disc, for example, a compact disc, to another. It's the same movie, but it's on a different substance. So Locke is saying that could be possible, and he puts out a series of puzzles about the relationship between consciousness and immaterial substance, which is a soul, and the relationship between consciousness and material bodies. He's saying, well, what if you live 2 lives, one when you're asleep, and that person goes around sleepwalking, and you never remember anything that person does, and one when you're awake? Is it the same person? And he'll say, in his way of speaking, no. Personality is only connected to consciousness and memories of things it's done. So now I will get into, I'm just going to read some of his very detailed language. I'm not going to say convoluted, it's just very precise, very legalistic. John Locke was influential in the establishment of the Constitution of the United States. And well, here it is on page 86, his definition, one of his definitions for personal identity. So who or what am I? That's the question. Here's John Locke's answer. This being premised, to find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and, as it seems to me, essential to it, it being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. All right, I'll stop there. That was one sentence. All right, the main points here, when he talks about it's a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection. How does he define reason? It's not clear. I think the clearest part of this definition is that a person is something that can consider itself as itself. So, for example, animals are aware. They're keenly aware of their environment. Anyone who has a dog or a cat or other animals I know at the College of Southern Maryland, people are familiar with, they have maybe horses or cows even. Animals are aware of their environment. They're even aware of subtle emotional nuances, a lot of times more so than humans. The question is, are they aware that they're aware? Can they turn their awareness back on itself? Reflection, like a mirror. Can they? I remember as a child, it used to fascinate me to see two mirrors facing each other. I would go to the department store with my mother, and there's the changing mirrors, and you'd see them lined up, and it would go off to infinity. The same image getting smaller and smaller out to infinity. I think that is the essence of what John Locke is talking about. Self-reflection is the essence of a self. To think about thinking. It doesn't mean from a Hindu or Platonic perspective that there's no soul in an animal, but I think what it does indicate is that humans are those conscious beings who can reflect on their own consciousness. And that is how Locke is describing a person. So by his definition, it would seem to me, animals are not persons. The Hindus and Plato would say they're persons who are not yet, they haven't yet reincarnated into the type of a material body required to turn consciousness back on itself. So they're waiting. They're not rational beings. They have reason in their soul, but their bodies can't express it. That's something Plato would say. John Locke definitely talks about Socrates and reincarnation, and he goes into some of the subtleties of what are the rational implications of saying that the self is connected to an immaterial substance that's separate from the body. He goes into those kinds of puzzles. But to simplify it, thinking of the fact that you're thinking, that's yourself plus your memories. All right, continuing on page 86, after that first long sentence, he says, another part of that one long sentence that I read, he says, it's impossible not to be aware of the fact that you're thinking. Freud would say, well, that's not necessarily so. A lot of us can think without knowing what we're thinking about. Well, even from everyday experience, you can drive somewhere and arrive at your destination and forget the whole time you were thinking about something else while you're driving. So some part of you was thinking while you're driving, or you would have crashed, and yet you're acting kind of in an automatic fashion. Well, John Locke is saying here that you cannot think without being aware of the fact that you're thinking. That's his premise. So continuing on this paragraph number 11, he says, when we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, meditate, or will anything, we know that we do so. Thus, it is always as to our present sensations and perceptions, and by this everyone is to himself that which he calls self. It not being considered in this case whether the same self be continued in the same or diverse substances. So whether the same self reincarnates through different material bodies with the same soul traveling from one material body to another, or if the self gets translated from one soul to another, and he goes through all of those possibilities, he says whatever the answer is irrelevant to his definition of a personal identity, which we've gone over a bunch of times so far. But he'll bring up in the next paragraph a very important problem with his definition of a self. Paragraph 12, page 86, about 7 lines down. He says, but that which seems to make the difficulty is this, that this consciousness being interrupted always by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of all of our past actions before our eyes in one view, but even the best memories losing the sight of one part whilst they are viewing another. And we sometimes, and that the greatest part of our lives, not reflecting on our past lives, being intent on our present thoughts, and in sound sleep having no thoughts at all, or at least none with that consciousness which remarks our waking thoughts. I say, in all these cases, our consciousness being interrupted, and we losing the sight of our past selves, doubts are raised whether we are the same thinking thing, i.e. the same substance, or no, which, however reasonable or unreasonable, concerns not personal identity at all. The question being, what makes the same person, and not whether it be the same identical substance which always thinks in the same person, which in this case matters not at all. And the sentence continues. So it's a complex sentence, but he brings up this important point. If you're going to define the self as the act of thinking about the fact that you're thinking, which he says is inevitable, unavoidable, if you think about the fact that you're thinking. So self-reflection plus your memories. Well, our memories are so interrupted at all times. None of us, he's saying, has all of the memories of anything we've ever done as an individual self at the same time in front of our mind's eye. So it seems that the self starts and stops. You might have a memory that you forget something, and then 20 years later, you remember it. I know a lot of the students taking this class aren't even 20 yet, but the point's the same. Do you remember what you did when you were 5 years old? Some of it you do, and then you might not have thought about it for 15 years, and then, oh yeah, I remember that. Some kind of a memory comes back. So was the self, was that not a part of yourself when you weren't thinking about it? Those are issues that he doesn't really resolve, and David Hume will come along and say, well, that's the essential point right there. There's no continuous self because there's no continuous memory of everything you've ever done. And I will bring up at this point, and they both have a very valid point, and that is why I'm very interested in, fascinated by near-death experience accounts, such as you can find at the end of Plato's Republic in the myth of a soldier who died on the battlefield, then woke up on his own funeral pyre and recalled his previous life. And I think most people have heard about, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, my whole life flashed before my eyes. Well, that concept of the whole life flashing before your eyes, at one instant you'd have every memory that you've ever had in front of your mind's eye. That's what a self would have to be one continuous, enduring self, according to John Locke's definition, and as we'll see, according to David Hume's definition. So, a lot of these near-death experiences recall the soul rising above the body into outer space, hurtling through space toward a point of light at the end of a dark tunnel where they remember everything simultaneously. And that's the cosmic, out at the outermost extreme of the spherical universe, this cosmic horizon. I went over this in some of the videos about holographic string theory. This is the latest academic cosmology. According to Locke's definition, if you were to combine it with that cosmology, what would be the self? Well, if all of our memory is interwoven at each point of the cosmic horizon, and these three-dimensional bodies are holograms, our true self would be the central point from which everything exploded and its encompassing spherical border, because those are the places where all of space and time are united simultaneously. All right, you don't have to have that for the exam, but I think it makes it a little bit interesting to his point about that. What makes the difficulty is the fact that our memories are so fleeting. Is there a place, is there some substance where our memories are all unified and we can be aware of it? There would have to be in order for there to be a continuous, enduring self, according to Locke's argument. All right, so he goes through a lot of scenarios with that definition of a self and trying to explain why it helps to deal with the fact that it's hard for us to tell if a self is united to a soul or not. So if we can't solve those questions, let's at least have some definition that we can work with that seems apparent to everybody. We all identify ourselves with our sense, our consciousness of being a person and the memories that we've had. So let's leave it at that and see how far we can go, and some of the practical implications of making that your definition of a self, just memories connected to a sense of self-awareness, self-reflection in the present. If somebody, for example, pleads insanity, I was a lunatic when I did this crime because I was in my mind, I was trying to represent some distant planet, and whatever it is, in some state of madness, John Locke would say, you weren't aware of who you were when you did it, so therefore it wasn't you who did it. Now, human beings can't be sure if you're making it up or not, and might be justified in punishing that person anyway. But then several times throughout the reading, he'll say, but God will know on the great resurrection day what everybody did. And he'll let everybody know. He twice refers to it. Here on page 95, he refers to the top of page 95. For supposing a man, so a man is just a continuously living material, human-shaped body. For supposing a man punished now for what he had done in another life, whereof he could be made to have no consciousness at all, what difference is there between that punishment and being created miserable? And therefore, conformable to this, the apostle tells us, he's talking about St. Paul, that at the great day when everyone shall receive according to his doings, the secrets of all hearts shall be laid open. The sentence shall be justified by the consciousness all persons shall have, that they themselves, in what bodies soever they appear, or whatever substances soever that consciousness adheres to, are the same that committed those actions and deserve that punishment for them. So several other places, for example, at the bottom of page 92, he says, after saying that you can be, human laws punish a person for doing a crime when they were drunk, even though they don't remember doing it, but, he says at the bottom of page 92, but in that great day, wherein the secrets of all hearts shall be laid open, it may be reasonable to think no one shall be made to answer for what he knows nothing of, but shall receive his doom, his conscience accusing or excusing him. So, according to the Bible, there'll be after, at the second coming of Christ, all the bodies will rise from the graves. They'll read from the book of life and remember everything they did. And that will determine their fate for the eternal world to come. So Locke is linking his definition of what a self is with that biblical concept of recalling everything you've ever done. All right, so we went over, explain the discussion question 2 on page 97. Explain the distinction Locke makes between the terms man and person. Why does he make this distinction? And the main reason he makes this distinction is because he's trying to tell what is a person. And he wants to differentiate a person from a man, which he defines as a continuously living human body. Discussion question 3. Why does Locke consider persons, as opposed to substances, to be the proper recipient of reward and punishment? Explain. So we really went over that already. Substances, a material body is a substance. So, for example, if your material body did something, either good or bad, you wake up the next morning and you have no memory of doing it. You genuinely have no recollection that you did it. And now someone says, oh, that was the brave man who ran into the burning house and saved my children. And they want to give you a reward. You don't remember doing it. So it wouldn't really be just for you to accept that reward because it wasn't you who did that act, because you don't remember doing it. Or, oh, that's the man who killed my dog. You don't remember doing it. You're brought into court. You killed my dog. Everyone, they say, look, here's a video of you doing it. You see it, but you really don't remember doing it. So Locke would say, you didn't do it. And especially in cases of insanity, he would say you shouldn't punish the substance, which is the material body. You should punish the person. And since that person was insane but is no longer insane, the person who did that crime is gone. You can't punish that person anymore. They're not here. What we have here, it's the same man, the same body did that act, but the person connected to this man is not the same, because that person here has no memory of doing that. So it wouldn't be just to punish this person, because it's not the same person who did that act. You could see how that could be controversial, but at any rate, that is how you answer that question. So going back to discussion, question 1, compare Locke's view to Descartes'. So Descartes said the self is an individual, immaterial, indestructible soul. It's an immaterial substance. Locke says, in his opinion, up at the top of page 94, that does seem like the more probable case, but it's hard to be sure, and there's a lot of conundrums that come up if you take that idea of a self. So to avoid those puzzles about the identity of the self with an immaterial substance or a soul, let's just have a more precise definition that we can at least all agree to. A self is consciousness of its own consciousness, self-reflection plus memories. We can agree to that, and we won't have to depend on certain beliefs that can't be clearly proven one way or the other. Okay, so the next video will be about the next reading in our book, David Hume, and it'll about his A Treatise of Human Nature, and we'll see Hume take this movement away from Descartes' belief in an eternal, or for Descartes, immortal soul, created at a certain point and cannot be destroyed thereafter, created by God, can't be destroyed, separate from the body. From that, through Locke, where he starts to say, probably we're a soul, but maybe not, to Hume, who's saying, if I am a soul, show me that soul. Which one of my 5 sense organs can perceive it? And he'll say, none of mine can, so if you think you're a soul, maybe you are, but I know I'm not. That'll be the next video.